Alright, so let's get these screws in place. And I think might be short one. I'm not sure whether I've got all of the screws here. I know one got destroyed, getting it out of the body. And I have in mind another one somewhere disappeared in the cleaning process. We should have another one here, I think. Oh, there's always more where that came from. Okay, that's good. Now I think we'll put the film advance lever on here while the going's good. I'm holding this back towards the end of the camera because that's our neutral position for our film advance lever for practical purposes. And then I can get these screws lined up. Okay, so if we press the release lever, we can move the film advance. It goes through one full range of motion, comes back to the stop, locks until you press the release lever, and you're away again. So that's all good. I'll check that that screws tight. Seems good. Okay, so far so good. Now that went comparatively straightforward. You might dispute that, but I can tell you can spend a lot of time fighting with these if you don't do it in that particular way. Where that chrome trim, can we put that on here now? I don't see why not. And there's strap lugs. I called them strap plugs, but of course they're not strap plugs at all. These simply hold the top cover in place. And of course they hold the chrome trim down at the same time. I think I can get my rewind in past home. soon going to find out. Yes. Oh, that was that lost and lonely screw that we couldn't find before. It's now reappeared, which of course is the nature of anything of this nature. Stuff is always on the go, it's always running away. So we'll get the two screws in here that hold the rewind in position. Put them up tight. Alright, so far so good. I think the back catch could go on and the door, I suppose. If I can find out what I've done with them. Well, here's our back catch. There's a little bit of corrosion on that. I think I'll just give that a little rub with a bit of Scotch-Brite before we put that in place. Okay, well that cleaned up. I'm going to lubricate this with a bit of synthetic grease, and I'm being more generous than usual, and that's mostly because of this has signs of corrosion on it, and once things start to rust they tend to keep doing that, so we'll protect it as much as we can. This chrome trim plate goes on the top there to hold it, and there are two tiny screws. Like all tiny screws, they do their best to get away. When they're both in position, tighten them up. Now we need to fit the button back onto the bottom and the return spring. So I want my pin vise for that. Grabbing the button, get that into my pin vise, presuming I've got the right jaws on there. Yes, just. Do that up nice and tight. I'll put a touch of synthetic grease down the centre of that, and here is the spring. The spring is always a bit hard to get in place. It's usually a bit misshapen. Now to get this in position, that tab, I'm going to hold that down, push that down firmly towards the base of the camera. That will keep that arm as close to the end of the camera as I can get it, and I can just start with my pin vise, and there's the button screwed back in, and it moves nice and freely now. That's how it should have worked before, but of course it was exceptionally stiff. Now the door, we can put the door back on the camera body, and that's simply 3 screws on the end of the body here, same size as all the other screws we've been using, nickel plated. Don't make the mistake of losing your chrome screws from the top cover in places like this. And I thought I'd lost screws earlier, but it looks to me like they're all here really. Okay. That's quite good. Still a little bit stiff in its release action. I'm going to take a little bit of molybdenum paste, and on the hook here on the door, just going to run some on that hook. That's where it meets the catch. Oh, that feels much better. Alright, so what can we say about this? Well, the camera body is basically done. We can put the chrome trim and plastic piece on the front and the leatherettes. So leatherettes first, I think. We can get the leatherette on the back, the leatherette on the base, the leatherette on both sides of the front, then put the chrome trim and so forth on the front of the camera. I've just wiped down the front sections of the camera body with naphtha to remove any traces of grease and oil and fingerprints and other rubbish that would cause problems with getting the leatherettes glued back in place. Now I'm just applying glue to the leatherette. The adhesive I'm using is called ADOS F2. Don't be surprised if you can't find it. It's only limited to my part of the world, I think. There are probably other equivalents that could be used. This is designed for gluing metals and wood and rubber. It's very good for things like that. It's a contact cement really. It's not really intended to be put on wet, but you can use it put on wet, and it has some advantages for us in that purpose, because if you're trying to fit leatherettes to something, you need wiggle room. It's very hard to get things positioned first time, every time, exactly where you want them. So it's important to be able to wiggle the leatherettes around to get them centered where you want them to be. And that's why the adhesive works best when it's still wet. And here I'm just trying to get that snug up against the hinge at that end, between the chrome trims evenly there. Quite commonly leatherettes shrink over time, which means that they may not extend all the way to the chrome trim top and bottom, but you do want them at least centered, you know. You want to get them as even as possible, because a small gap at each side is far less noticeable than a big gap on one side. And leatherettes, face it, they're just the trim really. They don't function much in terms of making the camera work, but they make it look a lot prettier. Okay, so that one appears to be on fairly well. That was the one that was still stuck to the body. The one on the other side was loose and free. Let's do that next. If you were having real trouble with getting leatherettes to stick, you could probably utilise the adhesive closer to how it was intended to be used as a contact cement. You'd put a layer of adhesive on both faces, allow that to completely dry, then put a fresh layer on one surface only, and then you could probably get it to stick very, very well indeed. It says leatherette's quite stiff. You also see that it was quite flat too. That's because they've been cleaned and pressed between paper with the cool iron. I'm trying to get this again. I want to get my leatherette up snug with that edge if I possibly can. And centered as much as possible on the body. And here I'm just pressing down where the Zeiss bumps were, because the leatherette hasn't smoothed out as much as I had hoped. Alright, that doesn't look too bad. We'll do the leatherette on the back next, so again I'll be following the same procedure. I'm going to wipe down the back of that with naphtha to make sure there's no greasy fingerprints, anything that would prevent the leatherette from sticking back. These have all been cleaned of course, but the camera has had an awful lot of handling in the reassembly process, and so there'll be greasy fingerprints all over it. That looks good. Right, so that's been wiped down. Here's the leatherette for the back of the camera. Now on the Retinette there's no word embossed on the back, that's just plain leatherette. So that means it can go either way up, which is an advantage in some ways, because it means if you put it on upside down, no one will ever know. I'm just looking at my dot pattern here. Your Zeiss bumps most frequently turn up where the rivets were. I'm seeing if I can just discern from this which way up this leatherette was. They're all symmetrical except we've got two down here and one up there. I can't really tell, so we're going to put it on any way we like. Now, a bigger piece of leatherette like this causes a problem, and it's because it's harder to get the adhesive on there spread out evenly before it all dries out. I can be pretty generous with this. I'll probably still end up wiping some off. The edges of the leatherette are very important to get your adhesive right to the edges, and that's because leatherette peels from the edges. Nothing peels from the middle. It peels from the edges. So the edges need extra good care to make sure that they are well stuck. I actually saw a camera not too long ago where the repairer had only glued the edges. And so the leatherette was floating everywhere else except the edges. I thought that was quite strange. I don't know whether they were just trying to be very economic with their adhesive. Okay, so I've got my leatherette there. I need to lay this in place on the back, and this will probably need some adjusting to get it centered up. While the adhesive is still soft, it can be just rubbed away with your finger. So that's to squeeze out around the edges and bits that have come off your hands while you've been trying to handle it. Much easier to get it off while it's still soft. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now, there are still bumps visible here, but if you can get them pressed down, the glue will often hold them down and you're not left with blisters. Everywhere you see a bump, just have a go at pressing it down. You might need to come back and do this over the space of the next 10 or 20 minutes too, just to make sure they're all done. But that looks better than what we started with. The front of the camera certainly looks a lot better than what we started with. It's lifting a bit right there. That's because the leatherettes are a bit stiff. They do not want to mould around those corners. Very often you'll have seen that with cameras, that the leatherettes are peeled up at the corners as they've dried out. Okay, that's quite good. Now leatherette on the base, I suppose, is the next thing to do. To do that, of course, we need to remove the film advance lever. So I'll wipe down this entire surface again with naphtha to get rid of any traces of grease. And that was a blob of glue sitting on there, so that's me sitting it down on that piece of paper. Okay, so that's good. Where's the leatherette for the base? Can't be too far away. Here it is. If you're dealing with small pieces of leatherette, your best practice is to blob the glue out onto a piece of paper and then transfer it to the leatherette on a toothpick or similar. Here, partly because I've done this a million times, I've just squeezed out a good blob onto the base and I'm just moving it around to get an even cover. You can see even though I had that much adhesive on there, I haven't got enough to finish this end. So I'll just put a blob there. And see if I can get these ends covered. Try and keep the adhesive away from the front face of the leatherette as much as possible. It's difficult with thin sections like this, narrow sections, because inevitably some will get around the edges and get onto the other surface. But if you can avoid getting the adhesive on the front face of the leatherette, that's ideal, because sometimes that leatherette, that plastic surface, might be very sensitive to the solvents in the adhesive. You can see quite clearly here the leatherette shrunk back in length. Sometimes you can sort of stretch it out a bit. But otherwise just get it centred up as best you can. A small gap evenly placed is much more desirable than a big gap at one end. That looks good, that's a good result. And the film advance lever, let's get that back in position. So I'm holding that in place with my hand, that tab pressed back down there. Tighten those 3 screws up. Don't overdo it, those screws on the plastic, if you overdo it you'll split that, sure as eggs. Right, the Leatherette patch for the film advance lever. Well, I've got one here. It didn't begin its life as the patch on an advanced lever. It was some other piece of leatherette, possibly even from the back of a retinette, and I've just cut a disc out of it. It's the matching pattern. I never throw away I hardly ever throw away any leatherette, no matter how badly damaged, that I've had to replace on a camera, because it serves as quite a useful source where you're just looking for a little chip of leatherette to do a patch, for example. It's not uncommon to have to patch something. Right, let's get that advanced lever a quick wipe with Naphtha to make sure that there's nothing greasy on there. It's not the cleanest looking, but there's a limit to how much you can clean plastics, particularly with solvents. And get our patch in place. Check it's all tucked in around the edges. That looks pretty good. Our tripod sockets around, that can go on. Now this is held on with 2 tiny screws, which are chrome plated brass, I think. Easily damaged, and you don't want to be the one that's made the scratches and something like that. Likewise, remember, you're going through plastic, don't go mad doing those screws up. Just rubbing this edge of the body here with my finger to remove any fragments of adhesive that has snuck out. And look again at the front of the camera, it's looking pretty good. Using the tail of my tweezers, I'm just pressing down on any lumps and bumps. But that looks pretty good. I'm happy with the state of that. That leatherette looks good. It's a bit dull on the back, but I haven't washed the back of that leatherette at all. Okay, next bit, the front part. Okay, so these 2 pieces go together. This just sits on the front and is held in place with 3 screws. These screws were loose when we took the camera apart. Alright, starting to look a little bit more like a camera, and of course that covers the front of the camera nicely, so the leatherettes look good. And really that needs the top housing sorted out now, with we know it's got a viewfinder problem there and we've got to deal with that. But as for the base body, the basic part here, that's done, and it's looking good.